Thank you very much, Jesse, and good afternoon. I think it's afternoon everywhere across the country now, so good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the workshop. I've got a lot that I want to try and get across, and still leave some time at the end for Q&A. So if you have questions, by all means, send them in, and I want to take some time to go through those with you at the end of the hour. What we're going to do in terms of an outline, we're going to talk about the CARE model. The CARE model is a model that I developed. It's a model for strategic communication planning, and that's really what the book that Jesse was talking about is all about, the CARE model. And so we'll talk a little bit about the origins of that model, where did that come from, and also how does it fit? How does the model work to allow us to plan strategically, specifically for communication campaigns? And then I want to wrap up by looking at a specific crisis communication campaign, which is unfolding right now as we speak. There is a campaign in Canada, all across the country, in fact, all around the world. There's a campaign to try and contain the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I think it's a wonderful, timely, real, and quite interesting example of the kind of insight that you get when you approach a crisis situation using the CARE model. And then, as I said, we'll have some time for Q&As at the end. So the origins of the CARE model, I began my career in 1985 and was working for, I remember, a community college in Cornwall, Ontario. And I was quite curious. I knew that I wanted to get into the business of planning campaigns, and I felt that planning was really important, but I really wasn't sure. I had studied communications for 3 years and still wasn't really sure. How do you plan a campaign? And so started to do it on my own, to just sort of try to plan campaigns, and ended up with lists of tactics, of things I would do and due dates. And so those were helpful, but they weren't really a strategic plan, not yet. And in 1991, those of you who are old enough might remember, in 1991, the United States and joined by other armed forces from around the world, including Canadians, I believe, invaded Kuwait to liberate Kuwait, because Kuwait had been invaded by the Iraqi army. And so they went to liberate Kuwait, and this was known as Desert Storm. And the general in charge of Desert Storm, who you see there, is Norman Schwarzkopf Jr. And Norman Schwarzkopf Jr. is, by all accounts, a very good military general, but also a wonderful communicator. And every night he would give a press conference and just sort of update the media on what had happened that day. And as I was watching one of these press conferences, he introduced this topic called MET-T analysis. And this was the way the US Army developed strategic plans. And I was fascinated. And I thought, finally, I've found my model. Finally, I know now how to approach strategic planning, and maybe I can develop a way to approach strategic communication planning.
Bernie, I'm sorry. Can I just stop you for 1 second?
Yes.
We just have a request that you change the screen to show just the slide that you're working on, because right now it is showing the slide plus your notes and the next slide.
Oh, really? How do I do that now?
Try the display settings at the top, maybe.
Yeah, display settings.
Try that.
Is that better?
There you go. That's perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, that's a whole lot better. Okay, so then I went to school. I went back to school. I did a master's degree in communication and a PhD in communication at Carleton University. And by then I'd been working for about 10 years and had this whole set of questions in my mind and things I'd learned about, things I'd read about, and started to explore strategic communication planning a whole lot more. And so the CARE model is really what the principle that is this entire presentation is based on, was not developed specifically for crisis communication planning. It was developed for strategic communication planning. However, by the time I developed it, I was working for an agency here in Ottawa called Delta Media, and was dealing with clients who were in a crisis situation. And so I used the CARE model to help those clients, and discovered, to my great joy, that the CARE model was ideal for the challenge of thinking through a crisis situation, thinking clearly, planning strategically, and making sure you do things right the very first time. So it wasn't developed for crisis communication, but it works, and it works very well for crisis communication, I'm happy to say. Now, I just want to come back to this notion of the MET-T analysis, and you'll see it's an acronym. There are 5 letters: METT and T, and they stand for mission, enemy, troops, terrain, and time. And so those are the elements that a strategic leader has to understand, has to know a lot about, and has to be able to manage very carefully. And you can imagine, if you're a military leader, you're given a particular mission. You need to take a particular hill or secure a town or something like that. There's an enemy, and you want to know a lot about that enemy and where they are and how many there are, etc. There are troops that you have that you control. There's a terrain that you're operating on, and there's a fixed amount of time. You have to get this done in X number of days. And so I was fascinated by MET-T analysis, and I thought a lot about it, and kind of distilled it down to the 4 fundamental questions of strategic planning. Why are we doing this, right? If you're going to plan strategically, any kind of a communication campaign, any kind of a military campaign, a sports campaign, a business campaign, you have to know why you're doing it. What is motivating you to do it? You also need to know who you need to reach and engage if you're going to be successful in doing it. That's really, really important. So military leaders have to reach and engage an enemy, but as communicators, of course, we don't. We have to reach and engage different publics, different audiences, is the term that I prefer. And so we need to reach and engage very specific audiences and get them to change their mind, change their thinking, change their behavior. What do you have to work with is the 3rd fundamental planning question. So a military leader worries about having enough troops and having enough time. As communicators, we have a whole slew of resources that we work with, and we have to assess those resources and make sure we have enough to work with. And I'll talk a lot about that in a couple of minutes. And then, what are the conditions out there? What's making it easier for you to succeed, and what's making it harder for you to succeed? And so that's the process of sort of looking outside the organization, scanning the environment, and making sure you understand what's going on out there. And I think you'll see how valuable that is in a couple of minutes. So that brings us to the CARE model. And the CARE model, like MET-T, is an acronym, and it stands not for mission, enemy, troops, terrain, and time, but it stands for change, audiences, resources, and environment. And so let me walk through this in a little bit more detail, as much as time will allow. In terms of change, it's understanding why are you communicating. And typically when an organization communicates, it's because it wants to change something out there. It wants to change levels of awareness. It wants to change the motivation, the attitudes that different people have. It wants to change the behavior of actually, getting moms to help their kids look after their teeth. So let's run a campaign to teach moms how to look after your infant's teeth. Okay, then that's behavior that you're trying to change. And it's also sometimes trying to change the nature of a relationship between, for say a not-for-profit organization and its donors. You're going to communicate because you want to try and tighten that relationship up as much as possible. And so this is the first step of strategic communication planning, is getting really clear on why. What are the reasons why? And those will give you your goalposts. They tell you what to aim for as you're communicating with the audience. They'll also help you evaluate your campaign much more effectively, because now you have your foundation for an evaluation. You know what it is you were hoping to change, and you can go measure to the extent that that's been changed. And you also, and this is what I found is really wonderful, is over the years that I've been using the CARE model, I found it's much more empowering for creative people. When you can tell them these are the changes that this campaign is designed to bring about, all of a sudden they know the words, they know the images, they know exactly what to say. And so having a really clear set of changes is a really powerful thing for creative people. The A, as I said, stands for audiences. And these are the groups, the individuals that you have to reach and you have to engage if you hope to bring about the change that you set out to bring. And so there are 2 types of audiences that I like to focus on. There are actors. These are the people whose behavior you are hoping to change. It's their actions that will change. And there are influencers. And my favorite example is if you're running a recruitment campaign for a university or college program, the actors are the students who will register for your program, register for the courses, pay their tuition, etc. The influencers are all kinds of people who will help them make up their mind about which of these programs is the best program, which school is the best school. It could be their teachers, it could be their employers, it could be their parents, it could be their peers, right? And so they're going to turn to all kinds of influencers. And if you know who the influencers are, you can reach them as well and help to shape the way they're going to persuade those active audiences. So the key for strategic communication planning is you want to learn. First of all, you need to identify who the key audiences are, the actors and the influencers. And then you want to learn as much about them as possible. And I'll touch on that a little bit later, but you want to learn about them as an audience so that you can construct your campaign precisely for them. Now, R stands for resources. In general, an army general has to worry about troops and time, right? Those are the two principal resources that a military leader has to focus on. As communicators, we have a completely different set of resources that we require. Now, time, as you'll see in the upper left corner, time is a key resource for communicators as well. We need time to develop our material, develop our plan, get things produced, get things shared with the audience, give the audience time to review and to think and to change their behavior. It takes time. And so this is one of the resources you need to assess. How much time do we have? That's going to influence all kinds of decisions you're going to be making after the fact. You also need money to communicate. It's not free, right? You've got a team, you've got to pay them. You might have to go to an outside, say, a video producer and pay them to produce some video. You might want to buy some advertising. That's going to take money as well. So as a strategic communicator, you need to assess how much money do I have to work with? You need people to work with. You need a team, right? And so typically, I've had the pleasure of working with some really talented communicators who were part of my team, and I could assign different roles to them. And so assessing the team of people you have to work with and deciding is it enough, and do they have the right skills is critical. And the last one up on the top row there is vehicles, communication vehicles. Do you have ready to roll right now really good communication vehicles? And you can imagine when you're in a crisis mode, if the organization in crisis has no website and has no social media presence, you've got a problem now, right? There are no vehicles that you can quickly use to get your messages out. So that's the top row. Those are what I call the hard resources, and they're more tangible and they're easier to assess. On the bottom row, we see soft resources, which are just as important. Resources like goodwill, which is the bottom left, right? Goodwill is how well people know you and how well people like you. How well do they like and trust and know the organization that's in a crisis mode? If people know them well and trust them, communicating on behalf of that organization is a lot simpler, right? If it's a brand new organization and all of a sudden they're in crisis mode, no one's ever heard of them, you're going to have your hands very full. The second one beside that is strategic intelligence. And that's how well the organization knows what's going on outside. Outside the organization, what is happening out there? What are the trends and forces that are making it easier or harder for you to succeed? And if you know that well, you can make really smart strategic decisions. And I've worked with client organizations who really knew the outside environment very, very well. They did regular public opinion polling. They did surveys of members of parliament and members of legislative assemblies, and they just knew how these people were thinking, what was changing, and why they were thinking that way. And it's wonderful to work in that kind of an environment. The third soft resource is internal cohesion. How well does the organization work as a team? Does the CEO get along with the board? Do the people in the marketing and sales department get along well with people in communications and PR? Do they collaborate well? Do they form a good, solid team, or are they always at loggerheads to one another? And I've worked with both. I've worked with some organizations who are remarkably tight and worked well as a team, and it's just so pleasant, it's so easy. And I've worked with organizations where, frankly, the left hand didn't really know what the right hand was doing. And that makes communication much, much harder. The final soft resource in today's day and age, in this age of social media, is probably the most important of the resources. Of all 8 resources, stories to tell are probably the single most valuable resource now. That's the 8th resource. Some organizations have wonderful stories to tell. I think of work that I've done with hospitals, for example, and hospitals have wonderful stories to tell. People come in, they're very, very sick. They get looked after by people who are incredibly smart and educated, and then they're better and they get to go home, right? I mean, it's a wonderful story. And some organizations don't have as wonderful a story to tell. So this is part of the challenge then. And so what you want to do strategically is look at your resources and assess them. And to assess your resources, you're basically going to ask three questions. Is the quality of this resource high enough? Do I have a good quality story to tell? Is the internal cohesion really good, solid, strong in this organization, right? The time that we have, is it good quality time, or is everyone so busy that 3 months is going to feel like 3 days, and so it's not good quality time? The second question is there enough quantity? Right? If I have 3 months to work with, is that enough? It depends on what it is you're trying to get done. And sometimes you're going to find there's not enough money, there's not enough time, there's not enough internal cohesion, right? That the quantity is what's missing, not the quality of it. And the third question is a little more subtle, but it's really important. And that is this resource yours to deploy? You, as the head of this communication team handling a crisis, and you look and you say, well, look, at my client organization has 10,000 employees, so surely I have enough people to work with. But you're just working on a crisis communication campaign. You can't tell all 10,000 people what they should be doing Friday morning at 10 o'clock, right? So all 10,000 of those people are not actually your resource to deploy. So when you answer those three questions, if you get three yeses, that is a strength. You've got something wonderful to work with now. If you get three no's, that's a weakness, and you've got work to do. And you're probably going to get some question marks where you answer yes to some and no to others. And so that's going to be a question mark. And I'll show you an example a little bit later of a question mark. And you might have to work with that one and fine tune it a little bit before you can really leverage it and make the most of it. So that's resources. Now, the external environment, same kind of idea. There are 8 seems to be my magic number, because there were 8 types of resources, and there are 8 what I call fields in the external environment. I'm just checking my clock here. Okay, 8 fields in the external environment. And so as a strategic communicator, and especially in a crisis situation, you need to get a sense of what's happening in every one of those 8 fields, because sometimes things happening outside are going to make it easier for you to succeed. And sometimes, as you all know, things happening outside the organization are going to make it much harder for you to succeed. And so the different fields of the environment, the top 4 are what is known as pest analysis. And so I have to give a nod to a business scholar, an American business scholar called Francis Aguilar. And Aguilar developed pest analysis and wrote about it in the late 1960s and early 70s. And so we'll give him credit for pest analysis. And pest stands for the political, the economic, the social and cultural, and the technological fields of the external environment. And these are a field, think of it as sort of a part of the external environment where specific things happen. So politicians make laws. Politicians funds programs. They increase funding, they decrease funding. Politicians set taxation rates. They increase taxes, they lower taxes, right? And so what's happening in the political field might be very helpful to your campaign. It might be incredibly detrimental to your campaign. So you study the political field. You study the economic field. If your campaign is in any way designed to get people to part with their money in any kind of way, it's a fundraising campaign, it's a sales and marketing campaign, it's a membership campaign, well, then if people have more money to spend, your job just got easier. If they, as is currently happening in much of the world, have less money to spend, your job just got a whole lot harder. The third field, the social cultural field, is really the field where you look at what's popular, what's trending, what is socially acceptable, what is socially frowned upon. It's a very subtle kind of a field, but typically public opinion polling will let you get a pretty good look at the social cultural field. And so, again, depending on what it is your campaign is having to respond to, what kind of crisis, the things that are popular and socially acceptable might make it easier for you to succeed. It might make it much harder. And then the final field is the technological field. And of course, this is a field that's changing on a day-to-day basis. There are always new apps and new tools and new channels and new vehicles being created. And so for communicators, getting a clear sense of what's happening out there in the technological field is really important. So that's pest analysis. That's Aguilar's contribution. I've added 4 other fields that I think are really important. And certainly in my experience, I've found that the more I can study and get to know these fields, the better I can plan strategically. The first one is demographics, right? Who are you trying to reach? What's the age of the people that you're trying to reach? What stage are they in their life cycle? Are you trying to reach teenagers? Are you trying to reach university and college grads who are just entering the workforce? Or are you trying to reach people like my mother? My mother's 85 years old, right? And so that's a totally different audience than people who are just starting their career. So understanding the demographic profile is really important. And there are trends and forces in demographics, which might also make it harder or easier for you to succeed. The next field is the competitive field, because what became really apparent to me is that you're never the only organization trying to communicate with a particular audience on a particular topic, right? So if you're trying to reach 85-year-old women in Canada right now, it probably has to do with either financial planning or healthcare, right? Because those are the 2 things that the 85-year-old women have to worry about. And I can tell you, you're going to have to get in line at that point, because there are all kinds of organizations trying to reach out to elderly women in Canada and talk to them about healthcare or talk to them about financial planning. So there's lots of competition for attention, and you need to understand what that competition is and make really good decisions based on what you learn. The third field that I like to look at is the media, the news media field. And I think this is really important for communicators. Not every campaign that you're going to work on is a media relations campaign, and I get that. But often the media are out there and they're talking about what it is you're talking about. And so certainly, as the case study that we're going to look at in a minute, COVID-19 has been all over the news media. And the news media is one of the principal sources of information that Canadians have on what is happening with COVID-19, right? So it's important to study the news media to see, could they be an ally for you in this campaign? Are they going to be an enemy? And I can tell you that when it comes to crisis communication, the news media are always involved. Crises are the bread and butter of the news media. That's what draws attention. That's why COVID-19 drew so much attention. Something terrible and sudden was happening. It's an economic crisis. It's a healthcare crisis. It's a crisis for the elderly. It's exposed a crisis in long-term care facilities in Canada, and so on and so on. There's all kinds of crisis woven into this. The final field that I've been looking at, and I didn't always look at this field, I really started to look at it at about 2001, 2002. I all of a sudden updated the model because I thought, I need to consider what's happening in the natural field, right? And the natural field is things like climate, things like weather, things like soil conditions, water conditions, health conditions. This is the natural field. And certainly in case of COVID-19, of course, that's what's primarily driven this crisis, is this virus. It mutated and it started to infect human beings, and it's now in every single country around the planet, right? It's a natural process. It's not a particularly pleasant one, but it is a natural process. So there are all kinds of natural trends and forces that might affect our campaign. They might make it harder, they might make it easier. So again, 3 questions to ask. When you're assessing the external environment, ask yourself, I've identified trends and forces that I think might affect my campaign. So the first question is it going to make my audience grow bigger? Do I now have more people that I can reach, more people that I can talk to? If the answer is yes, that's a good thing, right? That's a good thing. All of a sudden, there's a trend that's happening, and you're going to be able to reach more people. That's a very good thing. If you're trying to reach donors and all of a sudden you realize that, hey, I don't have a million potential donors, I now have 10 million potential donors, that's a wonderful thing. Is the trend or force making your audience more predisposed to pay attention? Are people going to notice what it is you're talking about? Right? And so, for instance, in a COVID-19 pandemic, if you want to talk to the public about a virus and antiviral medications, suddenly everybody wants to hear what you have to say, right? Whereas 3 months ago, good luck, that was a tough thing to talk about. And so conditions can change very, very quickly. And then finally, is it making this trend or force, is it making your audience more likely, more predisposed to change in the way your campaign wants them to change? Are people more likely to compost? You want to change their behavior, you want them to compost. And is there a particular change that's happening out there that's going to make people more likely to say, yeah, you know what, I like this campaign and I think I will start composting. Again, 3 yeses, you've got an opportunity. This is wonderful, and you can hitch your wagon to that opportunity and ride it. It's a wonderful thing when it happens. If the answer is no 3 times, that's a threat. All of a sudden, those changes are making it harder for you to succeed, and you're going to have to find ways to dampen the effect of those. And if you get a yes to some questions, a no to others, that's a question mark. And so you're going to have to think and reflect on those and decide if you can work with those or not. So all this to say that when you plan strategically using this particular model, the CARE model, you have 4 questions to answer, right? I have to look at all the changes I could bring about, and I have to select a few. I need to narrow that list. Only the most urgent, only the most important changes are what I'm going to focus on. Okay, and I've worked with clients who come to me and they've got a list of 100 goals and 1,000 audiences, and they want to do everything for everyone. And so the first stage of strategic planning is to convince that client to narrow the focus. A few changes, a few audiences. So that takes us to the second step, which is to look at the audiences that you might communicate with and say, okay, which ones will I communicate with? And even in a crisis situation, that's a really, really important question. Now is not the time to try to be everything to all people. Now is to identify who are the critical, important audiences relative to this crisis. Who is most at risk? Who is most affected? Who are the most influential people out there who are going to reach the people and influence the way they see and the way they think and the way they behave? It's the important influencers, the important actor audiences that I need to focus on, because this is a crisis situation. So I don't have a whole lot of time and I need to be focused. I then assess my resources and I go back to that list of the 8 resources, right? Remember the time, the money, the people, the vehicles, the goodwill, the internal cohesion, etc. And I say, okay, if I have strengths, how can I put them to work? How can I make the most of the strengths? I've got a great team of people. Okay, wonderful. I'm not going to try to do this all myself then. I'm going to assign the task to everybody and get everybody doing what it is they do best. I've got a great series of stories I can tell. Great, let's go. Let's work with those stories. Let's put them out there. Let's share them with people as much as possible. And where there are weaknesses, I'm going to do the opposite now. I'm going to try and overcome those weaknesses. How can I fix what it is I'm weak at so that we're going to be successful, right? So I did a campaign with a client and I knew it was going to be a web-based campaign, and their website, I won't name who the client was, their website was terrible. It was terrible. It was old. It was old-fashioned. It was static. It was dull. And so the first thing we did as we embarked on our strategic campaign with them is we changed their website. We massively improved the website and then used the new website as the basis for the campaign. Right? So that's how you overcome weaknesses. And likewise, you look at the outside world, the political, economic, social, cultural, technological, all those fields, and you say, are there opportunities? Are there trends and forces making it easier for us to succeed? And if there are, then you use those, you make the most of those trends and forces. And you tie all of your creative, all of your messages around those opportunities because those are helping you. And likewise, you're going to find threats out there, things making it harder for you to succeed. And so you're going to have to find a way to mitigate the threat, to dampen the impact of the threat. Okay. And if I had 6 hours instead of 1 hour, I'd tell you all about ways that you can, mitigate threats. But anyway, let's move on and talk about COVID-19. I got about 15 minutes left. So COVID-19 is an incredibly daunting challenge. And I can remember as this campaign, as this pandemic was first emerging, and there were reports of maybe a virus that was infecting people in China, and it was all very ambiguous and it wasn't very clear. And eventually the World Health Organization got involved and went over there and worked with the Chinese government and started to explore and realize, okay, we now have a global pandemic. And you might recall it took a few weeks before they finally, the WHO declared a global pandemic, right? And we've been living with it for a couple of months ever since. So it's a very daunting challenge. And I'll tell you why it's a daunting challenge. First of all, because the changes that you're trying to bring about are very complex. These are not simple things you want people to do, and they're things that often go against human nature. This is what's so difficult about this. I mean, hand washing, okay, it's not that difficult, and you can train people to wash their hands and teach them about different soaps and what to use and when. But getting people into the habit of washing their hands repeatedly, that's a whole different kettle of fish. So that's the trick with that one. Social distancing is entirely against human nature, right? And I go back to Aristotle, who more than 2,000 years ago wrote, man is by nature a social animal. And he was absolutely right. We are social. We don't like to be isolated. When you're in prison, isolation is a stricter form of punishment, right? That's what you do. I'm putting you in isolation, solitary confinement. It's torturous. We are our social animal, and yet we're asking people now to socially distance themselves and to stay home as much as possible, right? Canada's chief medical officer, again today in her press conference, said, we need Canadians to stay home as much as possible. That's not a human way to behave. And so that's a really difficult change to try to bring about. We're asking people to basically close the economy. We're restricting, we're shrinking the economy when all our lives we've been trying to grow the economy. So that's a really difficult thing, and it's causing a lot of financial hardship for people. And even in terms of testing, right? The messages about testing are so complicated, so delicate. Some people should go get tested in some circumstances, but they're careful to say we don't want everybody to show up and be tested tomorrow because it would overwhelm the system. And here's the great thing is that the recipes, the changes they want to bring about, the series of instructions we're being given are dynamic. They change over time, and they change from one location to the next. So the instructions that people are being given in Ontario and Quebec are radically different from the changes being given in Alberta and in British Columbia, right? Because the pandemic's at a different stage over there. But we consume media from all over the world, let alone all over Canada. And so it's very confusing. It's also daunting because, what am I doing for time here? Pretty good. Okay. The audience is, well, everybody on Earth. It's the most daunting audience you would ever want to communicate with. There's 7.8 billion of us, from what I can gather. We speak more than 6,000 languages. We're organized into 195 different countries. And then if you start to look at provinces and states and cities within those countries, the number of governments that are involved in this campaign is into the thousands, right? And we're a very diverse group, right? If you think of people all over the world, it's incredible diversity of age groups, of cultural groups, of occupations, of locations, of media consumption habits. It's mind-boggling. And so the World Health Organization can't possibly do this. And they know that, and they've been very smart to work with national governments and provide them basic information, basic tools, and let national governments who know the people well take the lead. And certainly that's what's happening in Canada, it's what's happening in the United States, and it's the right way to go because there's no way one organization could ever possibly run this entire campaign. Now, it's also a daunting campaign because there are some weaknesses, right? In terms of time, well, it's a crisis. By definition, a crisis communication plan, you never have enough, right? Every crisis I've ever been engaged in, every crisis that a client has called me in to help them manage is a crisis that started 2 or 3 days ago, right? And by the time they realized it and realized, okay, we need to do communication about this and call this in, it's already 3 days late. I mean, it's so crisis, by definition, you never have enough time. And there's also problems with goodwill. The World Health Organization is not an organization that is well known and certainly not well liked all over the world. In some parts of the world, it is well known and it is well liked. Okay, certainly in this country, I think the World Health Organization has a good reputation, good relationship with our government, and that works well. In other parts of the world, people don't really know. They've never really heard of the World Health Organization. And in some parts of the world, and I'm thinking, the United States, our neighbor to the south, there are some political forces that don't really like the World Health Organization that have denounced the World Health Organization. So that's a problem. Goodwill is not a strength necessarily, and internal cohesion is definitely not a strength. Okay, that basically what you have is about 195 different communication campaigns happening around the world right now, that were all planned in an awful hurry, and there's no real rhyme or reason to it. Everyone is taking a different approach to it, both in terms of public health, but also in terms of communication. So it's really problematic, again, because as consumers, we consume media from all over the world. I can watch BBC one night. I can read a report by Agence France Presse in the morning. I read newspapers from all across Canada. I read stories from American newspapers. I watch American television, Canadian television. We're all very, very connected. And so the lack of any kind of an integrated plan is a real problem for this campaign. Now, there are, however, strengths. That I would suggest to you that the amount of money that all of these governments are deploying in communications, the amount of people, skilled people, public health experts, communication experts, physicians, scientists of all kinds who are engaged in this battle against the pandemic is remarkable. The amount of communication vehicles that all these different governments, provincial, state, city, national, have around the world is incredible. And they have a lot of strategic intelligence. And the thing that strikes me about a pandemic is that now we have tools to gather so much information so quickly that you can go to Johns Hopkins University and see a dashboard. And this is updated minute by minute. This is a live dashboard that will tell you exactly what's going on, how many people have tested positive in every country in the world, how many people have died from the COVID-19 pandemic in every country in the world, how many people have recovered from COVID-19, and just on and on and on. You can click on 100 different places. It's a remarkable site. So the amount of data that is available of strategic intelligence is really quite impressive. Governments don't necessarily have to pay attention to it, but it's there. So in terms of the external environment, there are some opportunities. There are trends and forces that I think are helpful to a global communication campaign designed to mitigate the campaign, the pandemic, I should say. Certainly the news media is wonderful and is paying very close attention. And in fact, we've seen now that viewership and listenership and readership of news media, traditional news media channels, has actually grown in Canada and in the United States because people want to be informed. And so all of a sudden we're turning back to traditional news media to do that. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And then, of course, we also have technology, which is making it easier to access traditional news media because you can listen online, you can read online, you can go through the traditional channels. And also the technology is really important, not just for communicating, but for the researchers who want to stay on top of this pandemic, who want to find a cure for this pandemic, who want to find ways to treat the pandemic. Very, very important. So technology and the news media, I would say, are helpful in terms of fields of the external environment. But the rest, the other six, are a threat. Okay? There's political upheaval, there's political division. Just in Canada, we have a minority government, right? In the United States, it's an election year, right? So, I mean, politically, these two countries are in a process of change, very, very fluid, very dynamic. The pandemic has brought economic ruin around the world. And the number of jobless people has gone way up. The stock markets are still down, 10, 15, 20% around the world. I mean, it's really been a bombshell for the economy. Here we have a virus that targets the elderly. So it's picked a segment of the population, elderly people, which is not to say other people can't get COVID-19. They certainly can. But for people who are in their 70s and 80s and 90s, it's more often a deadly infection than it is for younger people. You've got tremendous competition for attention from all these campaigns by all these different governments that aren't necessarily integrated and cohesive, right? And you've got this menace, this virus, this natural virus, and we don't know yet if this is going to be like the influenza virus, a virus that mutates on a regular basis. If it is, we might be back here next year. We might have exactly the same conditions next year. It becomes much, much harder to immunize a population if it's a virus that mutates on a regular basis. We're going to have to wait and see. So yes, so in terms of threats, the economic environment, there's a lovely chart that shows you how quickly, if you look at the line, the bold red line on the very left, that's how quickly the American economy shrank by 30%. It happened in about 27 days. okay? And compared to any other recession, any other depression, even the Great Depression took much longer to shrink the American economy by 30%, okay? So economically, this has been a really tough time. Okay, 5 more minutes and then we'll turn to Q&As. And I just want to sort of talk to you about some strategic directions that we might want to consider. Based on what I've described for you now, using the CARE model, I think there are some strategic directions that come to the forefront. First of all, you've got a lot of work to do. There is a great deal of work to do because in terms of changes, the changes we're going to focus on, we can't just focus on awareness. We have to create awareness. We have to motivate audiences to fundamentally change their behavior. We have to provide very clear instructions and know that those instructions might change as the pandemic, so cycles through. As we start, the instructions we're given at the beginning of the pandemic aren't the same as the middle, as the peak time of the pandemic, and certainly not the same as the end of the pandemic. And we have to build greater sense of trust. So all of a sudden, relationships matter, right? People need to trust public health authorities. They need to trust governments. They need to trust the World Health Organization. And you can't communicate about healthcare in a crisis situation unless you've built really strong trust. So we have a lot of work to do, right? A lot of changes that we have to try and accomplish very quickly. And we also have a long list of audiences. I won't read through this entire page because it would take a very long time, but just even in terms of actors, when you think of it, elderly people, we have to communicate very carefully to elderly people and to the people who look after them, the people who care for them, their family, their friends, their caregivers, because there the instructions are a matter of life and death. We have to be very precise and very correct at the right time. We also have to communicate with the community at large. You and me are all doing what we can. Right now, we're doing a virtual conference. That's us contributing to the effort to contain this pandemic. And so we have to communicate with the community at large. We have to communicate, my goodness, with frontline healthcare providers and with essential service providers to recognize them, to thank them, to encourage them, because they're paying the big price right now. They're doing all of the work in very dangerous sometimes conditions. So there are all kinds of influencers we have to reach. And there are also what I call enabler audiences. These are groups who we need their expertise. We need them to look at our message and make sure that we're saying the right thing. So if I'm a communication person and I'm preparing the set of instructions for people on what to do now, I can't do that myself. I have to turn to recognized public health experts and make sure that I'm saying the right thing. So it's a lot of audiences and a lot of work to do. There are some strengths. Okay, so what I want to do now, I want to basically walk through what I think is a key strength and how we could leverage it, a key weakness, how we're going to overcome that, a key opportunity, and how we might capitalize on that opportunity, and a key threat. I don't want to suggest that this is complete. My analysis goes a lot deeper, but this is what I think is most important to focus on. In terms of strength, I think people is the key strength. You've got this wonderful international team of people. They might not even recognize they're part of a team right now, but they are. Whether they're in Russia, Great Britain, China, the United States, or Canada, these people are communicating and doing research and trying to contain the spread of this virus. And so what we need to do is create a platform for all of these people to bring them together. And this would be my number one strategic direction to leverage people is let's use technology, let's create a platform so that communicators in the UK can share with communicators in the US, with communicators in Canada, in China, in Italy, learn from one another, see what works, what doesn't work, and just improve communication. That kind of collaboration, certainly among communicators, is not happening right now. And I think that's a real missed opportunity to leverage this strength. We've got tremendous people. Let's create the forums to let them work together. The real weakness, as I mentioned earlier, is internal cohesion, right? Is that we have at least 195 and probably more like 500 or 600 different campaigns. By the time you count all the cities, provinces, states, and countries, we're into 500 or 600 different campaigns. And so we need, again, to create this opportunity for the teams to come together, to collaborate, to share, right? And so let's create the opportunity, use the technology, use the infrastructure we have to allow all these people to share and to collaborate, to learn from one another, and to integrate their campaigns in a way that isn't happening right now. And I think that would be the way to overcome that key weakness. There is a question mark. I talked about question marks, and that's stories. The stories are very strong. You're talking about a virus, it's very dangerous, it's very scary. You're talking about efforts to save lives. Those are very compelling stories, but they're not necessarily being told in the most effective way. I think a lot of the communication, certainly that I've seen in Canada right now, is rather stead. It's rather gray. It's dull. It's not exciting. It's not dramatic. It's sort of facts and figures and statistics and sort of simple little messages. And I think that there's an opportunity to do much more compelling stories, much more creative, much more compelling, get more attention, and get people talking about them and thinking about them. The key opportunity is definitely political. I think that the political world is typically one where there's a lot of division. Canada's no exception. We've got Alberta thinking one way, we've got BC thinking a different way, Ontario and Quebec, we've got the federal, and it's a mess. And then you throw in all the cities. And yet, what we've seen with COVID-19 is a coming together of all those people in a way that I think even 3 months ago we would have thought was unimaginable. And they recognize how severe this crisis is, and they are working together and they are collaborating. And across the political spectrum, we've done a very good job in Canada, I think, of coming together. Okay, less so in the United States. I think that the lines between the sides, if you will, are much deeper. The trenches are much, much deeper in the United States. And so we've seen a lot of political friction in the United States, which is really hurting, I think, their effort to communicate and to marshal people and get people to change their behavior. But we have had success in Canada and in much of the free world. And so let's celebrate, let's recognize that success and use those politicians who are able to do it, able to cross that ideological line and collaborate, use them as role models, right? And see if we can get everybody, all the political forces to come together. In terms of threats, the two big ones here I think we need to focus on are the economic and the social cultural threat. And that's really the ways that this virus and this pandemic hurts everybody, not just the elderly who get the virus and who, heaven forbid, might pass away from it, but all of us are feeling the economic pinch right now. And all of us are feeling that sense of isolation, of not being able to do the things and go to the places we normally would go to. And that hurts and that makes it hard. And I think that the way to mitigate those threats is to talk about it. And I find that a lot of the campaigns that I've seen so far don't really acknowledge that this is hard, that this is difficult, that there's a cost to being isolated, to being lonely, and there's a risk to this, right? The mental health impact of COVID-19 is something that no one's paying a lot of attention to right now. And I think in the months to come, the weeks and months to come, we will start to see studies that are going to show that it's quite significant. And so as communicators, I think that we can mitigate the threat by talking about it, reflecting how people feel, reassuring them, encouraging them, asking them to carry on, right? There's that wonderful British expression, carry on. We know it's hard, but let's all carry on together. And let's keep people focused on the fact that at some point this will be over. This pandemic will end. It's like any other pandemic that's come across the planet, they do end. And let's give people hope, right? And promise. And I think that would be a really positive way to do that. So a couple of themes to wrap it up before we go to questions and answers. I'm running a few minutes late. I do apologize for that, but we'll have 10 minutes for Q&As. It's a global effort, and it needs more sharing, more integration between all the different campaigns that are happening right now. I'm not suggesting one campaign can do it. I think I made that clear earlier, but at least let's coordinate, let's integrate, and let's have some leadership in making sure that happens. I think that we need to recognize that COVID-19 is unique as a crisis because it affects, everybody on the planet, all those different cultural groups, all those different linguistic groups, and it's not one pandemic. It's thousands of different pandemics, and we need to be reflecting that and speaking very specifically to different segments about here's how this pandemic will affect you and what you can do about it. I do fear, too, that audience fatigue is happening. And we see that when you see, you know, 1,000 young people show up in a park and have a great party at a park, as we saw in Toronto, um, that's because they're fatigued. I think at some point we tune it out. We say, forget it. I'm just going back to what I was doing before. And that's audience fatigue. And again, I think we need messages that recognize audience fatigue, that recognize this is hard, and that get people to carry on. And also we need messages that give people a sense of we are making progress. There's not enough communication about we are making progress. And finally, and I touched on this earlier, I think we just need more creativity, more innovation. We need communicators to be a little bolder, a little more creative in how they put together the campaigns that are going to inform and persuade Canadians and people all over the world to change their behavior in a way that will end this pandemic. So all of that comes from changes, audiences, resources, and the environment. Okay, so I'll turn it back now to the moderator who is online. Jesse, do we have any questions?
Okay, so if you guys have any questions for Bernie, you can send them in the Q&A chat or in the main chat. So I'll give maybe a couple seconds for those. Thank you so much, Bernard. We really appreciate you talking today. As a communication student myself, that was very informative. So.
Oh, good. Good to know. Good to know. Any questions coming in?
Okay, I just got an anonymous question here.
All right.
What type of innovative campaigns can you recommend?
For the COVID-19 pandemic?
I'm assuming for COVID,
yeah,
yes.
I'm going to assume it's about COVID-19. And certainly what I would recommend in terms of innovative is very targeted communication. So rather than put an ad on a TV network that is for all Canadians of all ages, I would use the social media channels and have very specific messages that are fine-tuned for specific audiences. I think this is part of the innovation that needs to happen, because everybody is suffering differently from the pandemic. Everyone is at different levels of health risk from the pandemic. And so let's use the technology we have to create not one message, but dozens of different messages that will go out to different groups, different locations across the country, and really sort of hyper target our campaign. I think that would be much more effective in this case. And I'm surprised that it hasn't happened this way. I think that it calls for a very targeted campaign. That's what I would do in terms of innovation. And as I said earlier too, I would really challenge communicators to be more creative, to be bolder, to be more creative, to have more fun with this campaign. Not that the message is fun, but just try different things and be more creative so that we have a kind of a message that will break through. I think a lot of people sort of see the commercial, oh yeah, it's all blue and there's words on it and there's a couple of graphics, but they don't pay attention because the commercial doesn't really pay off in any way. There's no great creative splash. I want to see a campaign that could run during the Super Bowl and that people would remember during the Super Bowl. And we certainly haven't seen that yet.
Yeah, for sure. We learn in school that if your target audience is everyone, then you're probably not going to reach anyone. So
Very
that's a
true.
example of that.
Yeah.
We have another question in the chat from Arlene saying, how would you remove the politics from the COVID issue?
What a great question. I think that the best way to do that is to encourage countries to let public health experts do the talking. We're hearing a lot from elected officials. And I think to a certain extent, elected officials, the prime minister, the premier, the president, they have a role to play in reassuring people, right? In comforting people. But let the public health experts do most of the talking. They're the people who are not political. They don't belong to a political party. And they're talking about science. And science is not political. It shouldn't be political. Science is about research, it's about facts, it's about data. And as much as possible, the politicians should step down, right? Especially now, once the pandemic has started and we're seeing its effect, I don't think we need a lot of reassurance. We need information. We need to know what should we be doing today, but we don't need a lot of leadership and reassurance. And so the politicians should probably step down and let the public health officials take the lead. And I must say, I think that provinces like British Columbia have done that very well, right? We see the chief public health officer of British Columbia much more than we see the premier. And I think that's actually the way that it should be done. Let the premier speak once in a while, let the premier reassure people and show leadership, but then let the public health experts really take the lead, and that will depoliticize the environment. Great
Yeah,
question.
sure. I think I definitely trust the opinion of medical professionals when it comes to a pandemic.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we actually have a few more
Oh,
questions.
wonderful.
So another anonymous message here says, how do you manage the message when other trusted sources are delivering opposing messages to your own?
That's great. That's a great question. And that's really why you study the competitive environment. And so the first thing you need to do is get a clear sense of who are the opposing forces and what messages are they sending, right? And then you can begin, once you know precisely who they are and what they're saying, you can begin to prepare your rebuttal messages. And so if we see some organization saying, this is all being overdone and we're losing our freedom, as we have seen happen both in Canada and the US, there's been concerns that lockdown was too much, then at least we're in a position now to start preparing our rebuttal. It's about identifying the organization, watching them carefully so that we can very quickly emerge with the rebuttal messages. You don't want to sit around and wait and find out when a reporter calls you that actually, this other group is saying this about it. You need to be scanning the news media, need to be scanning the web, scanning social media so that you can identify the critics who are out there. As soon as they start talking, you identify them, you see what they're saying, and you prepare your rebuttal. And I've actually been in a crisis situation where we had to do that, and we worked with a team of social media monitors who were just remarkable. And they were able to monitor social media all over the world and look for keywords and alert us. As soon as a critic emerged, we knew about it and we could start preparing rebuttals, right? So you have to be that fast nowadays.
Awesome. Yeah, we're always taught to think about how people are going to respond, including criticisms.
Yeah, you have to expect it. Even on something like a pandemic, you would have thought if ever there was a topic that we could all agree to, it would be a pandemic. Here's this virus, it's very deadly, and yet you see lots of division.
For sure.
Amazing. Yeah.
Okay, we have another anonymous. So this one says, what do you suggest when sharing sensitive information with internal stakeholders ahead of external audiences? Do you simply ask for confidentiality or be prepared for anyone to learn this information?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, part of a good crisis communication plan is to expect a leak. It almost inevitably happens. The media are so focused on the crisis, and they've got good sources, and they know what they're doing. A good reporter, and I say this with the greatest respect, a good reporter knows how to find sources and get access to information faster. And so you almost have to expect it. You have to be prepared, right? And so certainly what we do is we try to use a very small list. Our list of internal stakeholders who get sensitive information is very, very small, right? I don't need to send it to 20 people. If I can send it to 3 people and that's enough, then only those 3 people get it. And when they get it, there's a very clear statement right up front. Page 1 tells them, this is highly sensitive information. Don't print it off. Don't leave it lying around. Don't share it. Shut down your computer when you're not using it. There's sort of steps that people can take to try and protect that information. But even so, we prepare ahead of time. If it gets leaked, now we know and we're prepared. We've got messages, we're ready to explain, we're ready to respond. You almost have to expect it now with a crisis, that a good reporter is going to get a sneak peek at that information before you thought you were ready.
Yeah. Okay, and then the last question I'm seeing here is from Caleb. They say, have you seen any examples of very innovative / creative campaigns that you feel have effectively executed your care method?
Huh. That's a good question. I will dare to think back to my own career. And we had a client that was in a crisis situation. It was one of the national museums. And that national museum was preparing to build a new headquarters for all of the research that is done at a museum, all of the administration and research. And that museum was going to be built on land that technically was a wetland. And so this was a no-no. This was not a good thing. And so they were in a crisis mode because, and again, a good reporter gets to the story, and a good reporter found this story and broke it. And all of a sudden the word is, here's a national museum that's about to build this headquarters on a wetland, right? And so we had to work very, very quickly for that to understand the changes and the audiences that the client needed to reach, to understand the resources that they had. And what we found is that they did have a really a good amount of goodwill. They were well known, they were well liked, and they had a lot of credibility. So we were able to use that, and we certainly made good use of the goodwill. And we also looked at the external environment, and we found allies, right? And we found allies, and we found people who had a different perspective on the story. It turns out the land was only wet because a quarry owner next door had been pumping water out of his quarry onto the lot, right? And so that's why the land was wet. And we found allies, we found local politicians who were delighted to see that this construction was going to happen and jobs were going to be brought to their part of the city, you know, and so that's what we did. And we did this very, very quickly. We had a day or two to respond. But because we had a framework, we knew we had to identify changes, identify audiences, and shrink that list, get to the key audiences. We assessed resources in an afternoon. We scanned the environment in a day, and then we made strategic decisions. And that campaign worked very, very well. We were able to turn the tide, and all of a sudden the media, as they sort of learned about the complexity of the situation, came on board and came on side, and it worked out very, very well. So it is possible. And again, this happened in the space of 2 or 3 days, very busy days, I can tell you. But we were able to run a care analysis, develop our plan, execute our plan, and turn that crisis around for the client.
Awesome. That's a perfect example. And thank you
Yeah.
for your question, Caleb. And thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
For your questions. And Bernard, again, we appreciate you talking for us today. We appreciate all of our speakers so much. So thank you so much again for your time.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And I will also just point out that when you get your copy of this slide deck, my contact information is on the last slide. So you've got my email address, my website, even my Twitter handle, and that's a copy of the book. So just so you know, I don't make money when they sell the book, but I thought the publishers are really nice people, so I thought I would promote the book. So there it is, Strategic Communication. It is available at Chapters and Amazon. I hope you take advantage.
Yeah. Oh, Bernard, we actually have one more question.
Okay, bring it on.
So this one's from Sandra. They say, where does measurement fit into your care model?
Well, measurement fits in because you identify at the beginning the changes you want to bring about. This is one of the real advantages of being focused on change. We want to change levels of awareness. Fine, we're going to measure awareness before the campaign, we're going to measure awareness after the campaign, and we'll know, did we change the level of awareness? We want to change the number of people who become members of this association. Okay, how many members do we have before the campaign? We'll compare it to how many members we have after the campaign, right? So when you begin with a clear sense of the changes you want to bring about, measuring the effectiveness of a campaign is actually much simpler than ever. I mean, writing an evaluation plan for your campaign is really simple. Go back to the change section and just give a metric. How many new members do you want? How many, what kind of a bump in levels of awareness do you want? Everything is predicated on those changes, and that's the first stage of the strategic planning, is to get very clear on the changes you want to bring about, and then measuring them is much, much simpler. Good question.
Thank you, Sandra, for your question. Sorry for not getting to that sooner. Okay, thank you, Bernard, so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and we all
Likewise.
appreciate hearing from you.
Okay, thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the conference.